It's Monday. That means it's Spicy Monday. And we're here with a Spicy Monday special report. Was ScaleCon bullshit? That's right. Let's talk a little bit about ScaleCon. So I was recently able to attend an inaugural event hosted in Vegas by MSP Camp and the Tech Tribe, ScaleCon, a sales and marketing and growth focused event for MSPs. And it was interesting. And so I want to give y'all the sort of, you know, I have a lot of opinions about conferences. Give y'all kind of the rundown on what you missed, because a lot of the vendor community that's normally at these wasn't. And there was a lot of folks who don't normally speak or attend these shows that were there. So, you know, what the fuck's going on? So next year, you know, if you should spend your hard-earned doll hairs to attend yet another event. Those that don't know who was running this event, and I think that was one of the first problems. So MSP Camp, which is a marketing campaigns and just general sales and marketing assistance agency run by Tahir, who is a really, really nice person. And I say that because if you don't know somebody, it's hard to assess their values and ethics and then how those values and ethics transpose over to their event. And I think a lot of my vendor friends do not yet know Tahir. He's a really good human. And that counts for a lot. It doesn't make up for everything, but it counts for a lot. This was his event, and he co-hosted it with the Tech Tribe, but it was really more his event. And I think that's important because it set the tone for the approach to the event. And there was a lot of positives in that, and there were some negatives in that. And if you don't watch the whole video, don't worry. He's already aware of the things he needs to improve, and he's already started making plans to improve some of them. But anyways, that caused some interesting things to happen at this event that I don't see at the standard MSP channel event. First and foremost, I didn't see the normal grouping of vendors that I tend to see at these events. There were some familiar faces, but it was a lot of folks that I don't normally see either having a booth or they're there, but I just don't normally notice them because they get lost in the shuffle amongst more frequently seen and louder voices. So that was kind of interesting. We'll talk a little more about that a little bit later in the video. Another thing that was an interesting change was that, with a few exceptions, almost all the speakers were either first-time speakers or people that have spoken, but definitely not at the events that we all normally go to. And so that was interesting. And while not all of them maybe are great at speaking, you got to start somewhere, and that's okay. It was nice to hear for some fresh voices, fresh perspectives, and just not see the same people on stage all the freaking time, which is a huge pet peeve of mine. So I actually really enjoyed that, and I'm willing to overlook nerves or lack of practice or maybe not the best delivery simply just to have somebody new presenting a new idea to me, and I did get that. And I hope that vibe continues next year. That reminded me quite a bit of like Write a Boom or MSP Geek in that sense, and that was quite pleasant. Before we get too far into the video, let's get into the interesting part. Let's get into some of the details. Now, I had mentioned a little while ago that Tahir's a nice person, and that's important here because at some point, I'm sure they will release or they will publish their own metrics or results from the show. And I say with a fair degree of confidence that as long as the measuring method was accurate, I don't think anybody's going to be bullshitting you. So could be they collected bad data, but I don't think anybody's making anything up. Not that kind of guy, not that kind of company. Based on my observation and hanging out with a few other people who know way more about observing this kind of stuff than I do, they were advertising initially somewhere between 200 to 300 attendees. I think on the first day, given the amount of people I saw there, the 200 number might be accurate for aggregate attendees, but just based on sessions, popping in and out of the main speaking room and just counting people, I really couldn't come up with more than 120 discrete MSPs there. I think maybe about 150 MSP attendees, because some MSPs had multiple representatives there. And the rest of that was vendors and other. I will say that a lot of vendors I talked to that are experienced had a bias that it would be all sales and marketing people at the event. And they were definitely sales and marketing people there. There were account managers there representing their MSPs. But there's quite a few owners there. And importantly, not all of those owners were itty bitty, teeny weeny, one man shop type deals. I bumped into quite a few MSPs that were between $5 to $10 million in revenue whose owners were there. And this was like their first or second show they've ever been to, which just goes to show you how many MSPs are out there in the total addressable market. So if you're a vendor sitting at home thinking, I'm not going to go to that fucking show, it's all account managers, there'll be nobody there for me, joke's on you. There were people there for you and you didn't meet them. And now that revenue's not yours. That sucks. No, I'm just kidding. I think a lot of people reasonably felt that way. That's why we're talking about it. But so there were MSPs there of significant size. In fact, I knew funnily enough, a couple of the account manager and sales reps I ran into from MSPs. They were from pretty big MSPs that I used to be in peer groups with. I mean, some of those MSPs are like well north of 20, 30, 40 million dollars. Just wasn't principals and decision makers that were there from those MSPs, but they did have reps there. They did have people there. They did have people you could influence if you were in some sort of buying journey with that MSP. It's not a total waste of time. But as I said, only about 120 MSPs. For context, I think CompTIA ChannelCon had like 50 MSPs and the rest were all us talking to each other. And then if we look at like other similar size shows like Write a Boom or MSP Geek, probably similar number of MSPs and probably similar breakdown of not everybody is a buying persona. Some are just employee personas. So not terrible based on all of that. So a few of us that were speaking, you've seen it multiple shows. Me, Matt Solomon, Alex Farling, Colin Knox gave a great keynote. That's really good, Colin. Jennifer Bleem, Don Sizer, Brian Gillette. I mean, there were some names that you've heard before on stage. Very polished, very excellent. Don and Jennifer, especially. I shouted them out at the show, but just shouting it again. Some of the most polished and dialed in presentations, which a note for the future. I am not suggesting anybody make a quota, but one of those MSPs that I met that was pretty big was woman owned. Just saying. Maybe we get more than 2 next time speaking. So there were some speakers that we're all used to that were very polished, but what was kind of nice was most of the speakers were people who either I have never seen on a main stage at any event, and I go to a lot of them, or I have not seen frequently on a main stage. And that was kind of nice. And a number of these speakers, it was their very first time speaking. And I give those folks a lot of credit, and I give the event a lot of credit, because that's scary. When you're trying to have a draw to bring people in, having folks that are an unknown quantity is it's tough. And if we look at, I'm going to keep comparing this to MSP Geek and Write a Boom. If we compare this to other similar style events where folks are not paying to speak and maybe aren't somebody you normally hear speaking, there was that similar sort of vibe there, which I really appreciate and I'd like to see more of at every show. And I think there's a lesson somewhere in there to be learned about the fact that Tahir and Tech Tribe made the effort to pick people that they know are well connected and well invested in the communities of the ICP of the show, in this case sales and marketing. Everybody who spoke runs a sales and marketing agency or coaching or company of some type that has a really high level of community engagement in some sort of community. So they had an audience, just not a trade show audience. And I think there was some wisdom there to that. So if you're watching this and you're from a bigger event, maybe think about that for a minute, that like there are audiences that you could bring to a show simply by virtue of picking speakers that aren't in the trade show circuit, but are active in their own communities. Thought that was smart. Of course, there's some downsides to that. Some of the presentations had a lot of great information, but weren't that great because, well, first time presenting in front of a room of 120, 150 people, it's nerve-wracking, and not everybody's a born presenter. And of course that showed through. And that is definitely highlighted differently in this event format where there is one stage, only the main stage, versus a smaller breakout room. It's a little bit easier if it's your first time speaking to get in front of a breakout room where you're not literally up on a stage and there's a more intimate feeling with the crowd. It's a little bit easier to work through that. I think some people, their nerves showed through. I'm trying not to hold that against them. I know there were some posts on Reddit early on in the show that some of the presenters sucked, and whoever posted that, I think you suck because, well, you're not on stage, so shut the fuck up. If you weren't there and you wanted to know about the content, yeah, some of the content was not super dialed in, wasn't perfect, wasn't confident, wasn't the most engaging. It will be next time. Nobody's perfect their first time. But there was a significant amount of that. So then that brings me into the vendor experience a little bit. And I'll go into a little bit more in a minute some of the problems with the show. I'm leaving it to the end only because I think Tahir and the leadership team are already aware of them. They kind of self-identified them during the show and already have plans to fix them or at least address them. So I don't want to make the whole video about that. So the vendor experience, obviously I went both as a speaker, but I was there associated with a vendor as well. So one of the first things was that no one could pay to speak at the show, which meant that no one vendor could really get treated specially in terms of exposure to the crowd. So you really did kind of have to get what you put into it back out of it. You couldn't pay to play at this event the way you can at some bigger events, and there were positives and negatives to that, which we'll get to. I think in general, the vendors that are used to a trade show style, this reminds me a lot, once again, of MSP Geek or Write a Boom. If you're used to a trade show, let's say like IT Nation, where there is a massive trade show floor, or Datto or something, that has well-regulated times you are to be in the floor, out of the floor, with the event specifically driving traffic in or out of the room at that time and not splitting focus, this was not that event. And so if your normal trade show strategy is hang out at our booth and be charming or awesome and wait for people to come to me, you probably had a pretty shitty show at ScaleCon because it wasn't set up that way. Rightly or wrongly, that's not how it was set up, and that was not the vibe of the show. You had to put in work. So the vendors that I saw that were engaging with people, that were stepping away from their booths, that were participating, that were walking around, that were talking to people, that were showing up for breakfast, that were doing all those extra things, I think they had a really good show. And some of the people I was talking to, a couple of the vendors, one vendor had like 15 people sign up on the spot, like pay, sign up on the spot, and had like over 20 leads beyond that. A couple other vendors I talked to, like Helped, did pretty decently with having overall lead capture and folks coming up and engaging and setting appointments. One of my other vendor friends had more appointments set than they had last year at IT Nation. But everybody who had that kind of engagement was really like working the room and working the crowd rather than working their booth. I think that's worth knowing because I don't think tonally that's going to change much next year. So very much the same vibe as Write a Boom or MSP Geek in that sense that the conference is not full of buying personas who are coming there to fill their stack with new SKUs. These are people who are there learning new skills to uplift their business, and you need to know how to talk to them and work the room. They are not just going to come to you and hand you their email and a badge scan for an appointment. So if you do want to go next year as a vendor, and I really think you should consider it, if you are looking for people, it's going to be in Dallas next year. If you're looking for people who don't want to go to Florida, you have to approach it with that mindset. And if your booth setup and your vendor proposition doesn't lend yourself to that, you're not going to have a good time at the show. So rather than going and being salty about it, know that from now. So I want to talk a little bit about, I don't know, not negatives per se, but some of the things that made the show difficult to give 5 stars. And I think some of this was by design and some of this was just first time show. They know better. Just want to call it out for anybody who missed it. The biggest overall challenge I saw was that in an overall effort to try to not tell MSPs there what to do, to not be that show that, has a very rigorous schedule that tells you where you have to be at every minute or else, there was a real effort to not do that. And as a result, there was almost a complete lack of organization, which combined with a large Vegas hotel and not really clearly defined times to be at places, combined with the fact that there was only one stage, and if you stepped out of that room for a minute, you missed good content. It led to a juxtaposition where I think a lot of the attendees were exhausted and fatigued by the time 5 o'clock rolled around, because you got in that room for 9 a.m. and you were basically in that room nonstop, with the exception of a handful of small breaks that weren't really well defined until it was over. And then there was no defined, driven, here's the official event after event. And so people just dispersed, and it was very hard to keep track of everybody and drive engagement towards any one thing. That meant that all of the different after parties and events were sporadically attended. And really the only thing that I got any sense had any dedicated attention was the VIP events. And that was really only because literally Tahir was running them, and he was also running the show. So just by virtue of the fact of follow the guy in charge, those had better attendance. That's a note for next year. I'm sure they will work through that. But that was a little frustrating, I think, for everybody. And it was a little tiring for everybody. And there was a fairly large drop off after 5 o'clock of attendees. People were just tired. And I think that's why we see at a lot of shows, they don't follow that format. Simply because it's a long ass day to be in a room listening to people, to then switch out of that and go have fun. It's why we tend to see larger, more established shows do have actual blocks with mini breaks and tracks that are published so you can select what you want to see. Yes, that does drive down eyeballs in any one session since everybody isn't crowded in the same room, but it allows people to set their own pace, not get exhausted, and kind of stay in it to win it at the end of the day. The people who organized ScaleCon, they saw that happen, they were aware of it, so I am sure they will either lean into that in an appropriate way or make changes to address it, but that was a thing. Another thing that was a little bit challenging was in the effort to make the show completely vendor agnostic. I think we went a little bit too far. As I've talked about in previous videos about that Triforce you need to have at an event, vendors pay for the event and attendees come to consume, and vendors pay because attendees are there, and then you have engaging speakers as a way to kind of round it out. This event really did not have the vendor component in the Triforce. Here was, as many folks who are trying to make education first events make the mistake of doing, thinking that meant absolutely no vendor participation in any meaningful way, and really drove that down. And so while there was things I respect, like a vendor couldn't buy a speaking slot, there was really no directive from the event itself to drive attendance, engagement, or interaction with the vendors. And I don't think that was very smart. And I think the organizers observed that, and I am sure they will make changes for next year. But that did mean that it was very haphazard. And that meant that vendors had to basically be in the vendor hall area for the entire day. And so for me, that was 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., which if you've never done this before and you think that vending is a vacation, I challenge you to stand in front of a booth for 12 hours where you can't really eat or do much of anything else, and then come back to me and tell me what a vacation it was when your feet hurt and you're exhausted, because it's not a vacation. It's actually pretty hard work. So there was a lot of that, and I think that meant by the second day, most of the vendors they're just tired. They've had enough. So there wasn't really a lot of engagement from vendors in after-party events and things the way I would have seen in the past. Not the end of the world, just a note there. You could look at it in a different way. I went to bed early every night, which was kind of a pleasant change, and it was kind of nice not having to worry about waking up hungover. So if you want to take the positive out of it, I do appreciate that. Was ScaleCon24 bullshit? And I don't think it was bullshit. I said my good friend Tara messaged me on the first day in the afternoon and was like, how's the show? Because 𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒚𝒴𝒁 wasn't there. And I will go with what I told her then, which is it's adorably disorganized and wholesome. That was really the vibe throughout the whole thing. Yes, was it disorganized? It was disorganized. Everyone's first year conference is disorganized. If it's disorganized next year, then I'll be shitty about it, because that'll be year 2. But the whole thing just had this adorable level of wholesomeness to it. There was a lot of people there who have just never been to a show. There was a lot of MSPs there who don't normally go to a show, and they loved that vibe. And it had that same vibe that we all love from Write a Boom or MSP Geek, just kind and pleasant. The entire time, it was just kind and it was pleasant. Was it the best event that we've exhibited at in the last year in terms of lead gen? No. Was it the best event that probably most of the vendors have exhibited at? Probably not. Was it the most useful and engaging event for me as a speaker? No, not really. I mean, I had fun and I connected with people on LinkedIn, but it definitely wasn't my audience. But at the same time, I kind of don't care, just because everybody there just had this general vibe of let's all help each other. Let's all get a little bit better. Let's all get a little bit smarter. It was nice to not have a platform pitch coming from anybody. It was just pleasant. It was pleasant. And the entire vibe the entire time was just pleasant. And I like that. And I'd like to see that continue. I'd like to see that happen again. It very much had that same vibe. If you're watching this and you haven't been to other events, you definitely want to go to Write a Boom or MSP Geek, even though I have issues with how Write a Boom is run. Write a Boom and MSP Geek had the exact same vibe and tone you got from this event. Just pleasant, kind, helpful, little disorganized. Yep, absolutely. But good people trying to do the right thing for one another. And that's awfully nice to see. I've seen a small effort from a few of the big events this year. I think are starting to wake up to the fact that if they don't make a shift to that tone, that they're going to become irrelevant. Who knows, folks? Maybe we're at the start of seeing the entire industry make a slight shift more to being just a little bit more kind and pleasant in sort of the tone at these shows. Should you go to ScaleCon next year? I think you should. And especially if you're sick and tired of shows in Orlando, if you're sick and tired of hearing the exact same people speaking every time, you definitely should go next year because it will be different. And I think it will be a little bit more organized, but I hope it's still, at the same time, still a little bit wholesomely disorganized in its own adorably, wonderfully kind and uplifting way. ScaleCon 2024, it's not bullshit. You should go next year. Have a good one.